Hello, everybody. Rick Manning, Americans for Limited Government. Bidenomics strikes again as the U.S. deficit explodes even as our economy grows. That's the headline from this weekend's Washington Post. If you receive Americans for Limited Government's email, you got this article as part of your free package that you get every single weekday during that we send out. If you want to go to getliberty.org, put your email address in for you'll get information like this free on things we find interesting, things we produce ourselves, an analysis. But let's just look at what's going on. Shocking, after all the debt ceiling and all the fights that have existed, the U.S. deficit's expected to reach over $2 trillion in fiscal year 2023. Remember, federal fiscal year is October of the previous year, October of 2022 to September 30th of 2023. That's fiscal year 2023. And the deficit which was last year, fiscal year 2022, was 1.375 trillion, is now projected to go up to over $2 trillion based upon the first 10 months of the fiscal year. So we know how much the deficit's gone up in the first 10 months of the fiscal year, and projecting it out, it will be well over $2 trillion. Let's talk about but Joe Biden, he's hitting the stump for Bidenomics. Let's see what he has to say, because he's always got something interesting to say, true or untrue. But here we go. Here's Joe Biden talking about Bidenomics.
On my watch, we're making infrastructure a decade headline, a decade. Yesterday, we announced that since I took office, we've attracted $500 billion, $497 billion in private investment in American manufacturing, both here and around the world. It's historic. And it's Bidenomics in action. Instead of exporting jobs to cheaper labor costs, what we did for decades, we're creating jobs here and exporting American product, not jobs. That's the story here in South Carolina. Earlier, we heard the leadership of Enphase say that $60 million they're investing here. Well, that's 1,800 jobs across the country, and up 600 permanent jobs right here in South Carolina. All a direct result of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act we wrote and passed. Well, that's the legislative past where so much money is coming in to make all this happen. By the way, parenthetically, I want you're going to hear about the deficit. I cut the deficit $1.7 trillion in 2 years. Nobody's ever done that. Cut the debt 1.7. This generates income.
Okay, let's just deal with this whisper campaign of I cut the deficit 1.7 trillion in 2 years. Let's just look at what the truth is. I don't actually think I've got that chart, but it's here's, where is it? I've got to have it. Don't have it. Okay, let's just talk about cutting the deficit 1.7 trillion. Here is what is true. Deficit surges again after briefly falling. This is the Washington Post, folks. This is the Washington Post telling you that the deficit surges again after briefly falling. So here's what happened. We had COVID in 2020. You might remember that. 2021, COVID spending somewhat abated, down from $3.1 trillion deficit, $2.8 trillion deficit. Then it dropped because COVID spending abated a great deal and basically ran out, and it was actually 1.375 trillion. I don't know why they've got it 1 trillion here, but and then now it's projected at over $2 trillion. So the reality is his $1.7 trillion cut and the deficit that he's claiming is all of COVID spending running out. It has nothing to do with him cutting spending. It has to do with COVID emergency ending and the spending running out. That, by the way, the Democrats voted for, and truthfully, Republicans voted for too. So he didn't cut anything. And in fact, during the debt ceiling, those of you who remember, he was adamant that, no, we don't need to make any more cuts. We need to go full speed ahead with spending as usual. And it was only after threats of going past the debt ceiling, that a deal was cut that ended up making cuts of about 1.6 trillion over 10 years, off of a baseline budget that was dramatically inflated. A lot of Republicans, Freedom Caucus and the like, didn't like that deal, said it wasn't enough. Well, maybe they knew something. Maybe they knew something, because we are now projected at over $2 trillion this fiscal year. So his big cut in the deficit is going from, he's not going to say 1.7 anymore. He's got to say 0.7 trillion, as opposed, and maybe there's a reason he wants to whisper that number. I don't know. Anyway, point being, you have you have the deficit running at a higher pace than in a time of a relatively good economy. You've got full employment. And this is something that kind of confounds a lot of the government, the economists, is that how do you have a budget that's, I'm going to go to a different chart here. How do you have a budget deficit that goes from very relatively small, well, not relatively small, 1.375, and doesn't go down when you're full employment, when everybody's working who wants a job? Well, one of the reasons is when you have, the inflation rate that existed for last tax season was indexed. And so you didn't get thrown into a higher tax bracket based upon having getting a 10% increase in your pay. But because nobody was getting a 10% increase in your pay, what happened was a lot of the dollars that they earned were taxed at a lower tax rate than they would have been otherwise. And as a result, a significant amount of the money that would have come in on the revenue side didn't come in. And because the perverse aspect of indexing taxes, while it creates fairness because people don't get thrown into a higher tax bracket based upon inflation, but the perverse aspect of it is that you can end up having less of your money taxed because of inflation, because the money's worth less. And that's what happened. And it's fair or unfair. I think it is fair, but it's just a fact of what happens. And so the revenues from the biggest provider of revenues for our federal government, which is our personal income tax, went down pretty significantly, about 300 billion. So that's one of the things that happened. Another thing that happened was capital gains went down because 2022 was a pretty bearish year in terms of the stock market, and so a lot of capital gains that got booked in 2021 people weren't selling, or if they were selling at a loss in 2022, and so they didn't have the capital gains revenue that was coming in on the revenue side. And the third piece of this equation that's somewhat devastating is when you look at it and here's the chart. I think it's pretty easy to see. I'm going to increase its size a little bit for you. I'm just going to get out of the picture and let this be the picture. So I'll just go to there. Move my face. No, move my face up further. Okay, I'm getting out of the picture so you can see this better. Okay, individual income tax. This is what our current money is. This is what we're currently looking at. We're going to end up spending about this is the total outlays for the first 10 months. We'll end up spending another $1 trillion, $1.2 trillion if we maintain the average of what we're spending over the last 10 months. So $1.2 trillion. So we'll end up with an outlay of about $6.6 trillion. Okay. Yeah, 6.5, about $6.5 trillion, maybe a little higher than that. And what are you spending the money on? Social Security. Social Security was indexed, so everybody got a Social Security check that went up by about 9%, and that money comes out of Social Security. So this number became bigger than projected. Health. That's that's Medicaid and the like, not Medicare, but Medicaid, 741 billion. income security. Okay, that's things like unemployment insurance and things like that. Welfare, 666 billion. National defense, 666 billion. 666 seems to be a pretty common number in this budget. Medicare, 657 billion. I'm going to point out that of the top 5 items, only one of them Congress takes a look at every single year. The rest are called mandatory spending, and it just shows that it's not really it's basically spending that's just on kind of auto tune. It just keeps going, and so Congress might adjust it to a cost of living adjustment or things like that. But by and large, they don't examine that spending. That spending doesn't end up getting scrutinized and attempting how do we cut that spending, because it's politically somewhat not viable to say, gee, how do we cut Social Security? Because suddenly everybody thinks their Social Security is going to get cut, and that may or may not be the case. But when you open the door to saying I want to take a look at cutting Social Security or minimizing the growth of Social Security, people say, wait a second, hold on, wait, that's something which I paid into. That's not right. Similarly with Medicare, where quite honestly it's pretty crappy insurance, but people say, oh, don't touch my Medicare. The health and Medicaid is on autopilot. Income securities, things like food stamps and the like, that's on autopilot. And we don't end up looking at actually those expenditures, because there's a heavy cost. Suddenly, if you want to talk about food stamps, you say, oh, you want to take food out of the poor people's mouths. And you want to talk about, but you don't mention, like on Medicaid, you don't mention that most states now are, I think all but 7, Medicaid's available to people, families of 4 make over $83,000 a year. So it's not really poor people health insurance anymore. It's middle-class health insurance. That's the truth. But we can't take a look, but we don't take a look at that. So then you go down to things like net interest on the debt. Can't touch that. That number is actually going up pretty dry. Is going to end up in the $600 billion level, 650 for this particular year. That's money that, because we're borrowing so much money, that's money that we have to spend to pay for our borrowing. That's like the interest you get back in the old days when you had a savings account, you got interest from the bank. That's what that is. That's a bond. That's a bond payment that we owe as a federal government, that the people of the United States owe to banks and countries around the world who buy our treasuries and keep buying our treasuries sufficiently that our interest rates are relatively low compared to where they might be. You got education, you've got veterans benefits, you've got transportation, you got other. So basically, of the first 6 things on here, with net interest on the debt, only one of them, the national defense function, ends up getting debated by Congress on an annual basis. So when we're talking about the budget shortfalls and the like for this year, when we're talking about what are we going to do, and we're going to have a government shutdown if we don't pass a continuing resolution in September, because this is the month when we fight over the budget. That's why I'm doing this thing right now. We're talking about that. What we're not going to be talking about is Social Security, health, income security, interest on the debt. None of those things will be touched by the appropriations bills Congress passes. What will be touched is national defense, education, veterans, transportation, and other. Those are the things that will be touched. We'll be touching effectively about the same amount of money in the entire in the budget that we spend on Social Security alone. It'll be a little bit more than that. It's about 1.8 trillion. How much we're actually talking about? So let's say Social Security and health together. That's about, or Social Security and Medicare, even better. So that's how much money, how much we're going to be discussing for the entire budget. Everything that you think about the government does, and when we're talking about shutting down the government, we're going to be talking about the same amount of money that we spend on Social Security and Medicare on autopilot. becomes pretty obvious that when you have a discussion, when you try to figure out how to solve this Rubik's Cube, you only have two sides of this equation. You have how much you spend and how much you bring in. And you can either bring in more, which means higher taxes, or you could spend less, which means fewer outlays. But when your outlays are so skewed towards a few big ticket items that Congress doesn't want to touch, because if they do, they lose their elections. So then you look over at the revenue side. Right now we're at about 1.8 billion in or 1.8 trillion dollars in individual income taxes. That'll go up to about 2.2 or so. This is Social Security payments. Social Security payments, retirement 1.36. They include in this social insurance and retirement. They include in this everything for your payroll taxes. So that includes your unemployment insurance. It includes your Social Security. It includes Medicare. Okay, so you do a quick math and you can see that you're spending a lot more on Medicare and Social Security than you're bringing in from current payroll taxes. Obviously a problem. Corporate income taxes, 320 billion. Everybody thinks corporate income taxes is huge. Well, corporate income taxes has been around 300 to 400 billion since I've been looking at this. And so it's not an insignificant part of the budget. It's the third biggest contributor in terms of the revenues of the government. But the fact of the matter is your corporate income taxes alone don't cover your net interest on the debt. Customs and duties. So that's, things come in, imported about 67 billion, excise taxes, cigarettes, alcohol, 60 billion. The state and gift taxes. We're having a big fight over state and gift taxes because Republicans lowered the amount of money, the costs on the liability on a state and gift taxes, saying, you've already paid taxes on that money. Why are we now driving out farmers and other landowners who have to sell their land in order to pay off estate taxes? That's a fight we're going to end up having in the next year or 2 years again. But that brings in about 29 billion, miscellaneous 24 billion. Point being, that's how you have a $1.6 billion deficit at the end of July. By the end of September, that deficit is going to be 2.2 trillion, because it's not the revenue side. You're through April. You've got your big tax revenue collection times. So your revenues that you're going to get in 2020 in the next 2 months are pretty much a knowable thing, and your expenditures are going to be higher, because governments have budgets, they have appropriations, and your various departments have to, they have appropriated dollars, they are going to spend those dollars. And so this is the outlays are a reflection before the September spending spree. Now, it's not a spending spree that's hundreds of billions of dollars, but it's a spending spree that's a few $billion. So you'll end up with outlays, like I say, 6.5, 6.7 trillion. You'll end up with receipts that are around 4.2 trillion. And as a result of that, you're going to end up with a world of a massive 2 trillion plus budget deficit. And I just sit there and I always think, what if only we'd had a debt ceiling fight, a debt ceiling where we could pay attention to what was happening in our deficit. But the debt ceiling fight, as you remember, all devolved down to some simple things. It devolved down to some very simple concepts. And the simple concepts were, what are we going to do? How, we're going to end up defaulting on the debt. Oh no, we're going to end up, people are standing in the world's going to go down. Banks aren't going to like us, blah, blah, blah. And nobody talked about this, the actual problem. We spend too damn much money, and truthfully, we may not take in enough. And unfortunately, because we have a printing press and an seemingly insatiable demand for our treasuries, both sides of the aisle can go walking down the halls of Congress going nah, 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 and pay no attention to it. That's what, and we will have. So we're going to have a big fight. You're all going to see it in the next 3-4 weeks. It's going to be a big fight. And some Republicans are going to say, we need to do something. And Kevin McCarthy is going to say, we have to deal with the reality that we only control one house and we only have a 4-vote majority in that house. And the Republicans are going to say, but we have to do something. This is a crisis. And Joe Biden's going to say, everything's okay. We're in good shape. Don't worry about it. Pay no attention to the numbers. And the Democrats are going to be, well, we need to spend more money on. We really need to spend more money on social welfare programs. We're not spending enough, and ultimately, you're going to end up in a stalemate. And they'll come up with some deal that has some marginal changes in terms of how the money gets spent over a 10-year period. And it'll be, they'll make a $30 billion cut on an annual basis in a $6.8 billion problem. That's what you can expect to happen. We're going to fight it. We're going to fight like crazy on this issue. But the fact is, as a realist and having been around here for a while, if you get a $30 billion cut on top of the annually, on top of the 35 billion or so that you got last time, I guess you got slightly more than that last time. And you get, let's say you had 80 billion last time. So suddenly you have 110 billion. We didn't come into this problem in one fell swoop, although we kind of have a few fell swoops that did it. Obamacare being one big thing. The budget implications of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically a spending bill, which is going to increase inflation, by the way. But ultimately, this is what we have. We have a series. Our government is responsive to a series of spending decisions that have been made over the course of the last 70 years. And those spending decisions all we're going to spend a little bit. At the time, we were spending next to nothing. And then they grew and they grew and they grew. And suddenly, they swamp the revenues, the receipts that we take in. And people then don't want to deal with the fact that you have a system that's upside down. It doesn't work. And the one piece of this puzzle that should scare the heck out of everybody, I'm going to go back to this chart, should scare the heck out of everybody, is this piece, the net interest on the debt. Folks, this is at about assuming about a 2.7% interest rate for this year on our treasury bills on average. When some of those bills mature, because a lot of them are long term and they don't cash them in until they mature, if they were higher, they would pay them out and reissue at a lower interest rate. So we've got a lot of our treasury bills out there, the longer term ones, are at a pretty low interest rate. But every single one of those ones, when they come due right now, we're having to pay a higher interest rate on them. And as a result, we're paying a higher interest rate on these bills, these treasury bills. Even if we had the same, even we're running a balanced budget, you would see the net interest rates going up. But you add an extra $2 trillion onto monies that you have to borrow, and you put $2 trillion and you have, let's say, a 1% increase in the percentage, as opposed to paying 2%, you pay 3% interest on that money, just as a hypothetical. So if you pay 3%, you have a 1% increase. 1% of $2 trillion of additional debt is what? Well, it's $20 billion. Now it's $40 billion. So every single year, you're going to have $40 billion of additional money, additional costs for that debt. Now, when you say, okay, well, it's really 3%, it's a 1% increase, but it's really 3% interest on new money. Well, that's $120 billion. So that number, which will be about 650 when we at the end of this fiscal year, that number suddenly next year has to be projected at 750 to 800 billion dollars, because you've added that 2 trillion, and which is effectively 120 billion dollars in new interest payment debt. It's not counting the debt that you have to roll over that was a lower interest rate that now is a higher interest rate. It's not counting that debt. That's how come this net interest number matters, because it's the mouse eating the electrical cords. That at some point it eats enough of the electrical cords, everything shorts out and your system dies. It's the thing, it's the one piece of this that there's really nothing Congress can do about. They can change laws to change any of these other things. Change laws to change any of the revenues. The one piece of this puzzle that's completely out of Congress's control is the net interest on the debt. It's a bill that has to be paid. It's the mortgage. You don't have a choice. And that mortgage is beginning, because it's like an ARM. It is beginning to eat more and more and more of your tax dollars. And just to put that into perspective, we put in first 10 months, we put $1.6 billion $3.7 billion in total receipts. But only 3.1 billion of those, get to go to programs that benefit Americans. The rest go to pay interest payments on the debt. That's the reality of this. We keep feeding this mouse through higher budget deficits and through more and more borrowing. And it's a mouse that is going to eventually consume all the cheese. And when that happens, folks, all those programs that everybody loves, all those big ticket items, nothing will be sacred. And on the tax side, your taxes are going up. So a lot of this seems I know it's boring and people sit there, you talk about numbers, but the reality is we're going to have a fight over this September. And hopefully we're able to make some small incremental changes. And hopefully the next next couple of fights we have, we'll be able to make some incremental changes. And we'll be able to gnaw away at this a little bit. But understand that the incremental changes we're making will likely barely cover the cost of the increase of the net interest that we're paying. Because we have a systemic problem. This isn't, gee whiz, I spent a little extra money last week, honey, let's see what we can do. This is 60 years ago, I decided to take out a mortgage on the house, but it's a mortgage that never ends, and the payments continually increase. And I'm sitting there now saying, wait a second, this used to be $50 a month, and I could afford that. And now it's $500 a month, and I can't afford that. That's what we've got. We've got built-in spending that's about 70% of our budget. 70% of our spending is on autopilot. Unless we start focusing and actually dealing with some of the autopilot, and waste, fraud, and abuse is part of that. But dealing with some of the autopilot spending, unless we start doing that, we're dead. It might not be in my lifetime, but at some point, somebody's going to say, we can't afford this, or the banks will say, the banks and the other foreign governments who buy our debt will say, we're not going to buy your debt anymore. At which point you see massive increases in interest rates on the debt, and you find yourself with all your receipts being eaten up by your interest payments. And folks, that's a really bad thing. That's a really, really, really bad thing. In countries that have that happen, have hyperinflation, which is inflation typically over 100% in a year, and their dollars become worth nothing. And the average person who's done everything right, who's worked their butts off, saved, done everything right, finds that the money they have in their banking account isn't worth the paper it was printed on. It happens to countries all over the world. Almost every year, somebody ends up in a hyperinflation cycle. And it's because of exactly what this chart shows. And we are fortunate because we're big enough. We're kind of almost, and some people believe we're too big to fail, but we're big enough that people buy our debt because they believe the U.S. government will be good and will make good on the $5.61 billion in net interest. So it's a safe investment. At some point, people, for reasons sometimes benign financial choices, or for not so malignant choices to try to take down the United States, they'll use the net interest payments as a weapon. They'll use our debt as a weapon against us. And we will have handed those who seek evil against our country the weapon to destroy us. I'm going to go and take a look at our chat, see what we're doing here. And I appreciate those of you who hung on this. I know it's a hard topic. Let's see here. We've got, I'm going to show one thing. This was I think on education. Joel Rossenberger, that's a subject you have to blame local government on. On education, one of the interesting things about education is the federal government has become so imbued into the funding of local education that regulations the federal government passes drive decisions at the local level a great deal. So we do have a federal problem with that. But yes, I encourage everybody to get heavily involved in their local elections, and particularly school board elections, and get people elected who are working hard and who are going to work to try to make it so our schools are safe and we can send our kids to schools knowing they'll get educated and not indoctrinated. Here we go. Marjorie Kern. How about saying money and supplies? Stop spending money and supplies so Ukraine to stop funding illegals and everything that our homeless citizens, veterans can't get. Marlene, I think you're onto something there. It certainly would be, Joe Biden throws around 25 billion, 100 billion for Ukraine pretty easily off the tip of his tongue, and as if nobody has to pay for it and it's free money. In fact, the matter is it's not free money. And similarly, we put it this way: when you think about the cost of illegals, there's always people who say, "No, wait a second, they're working in the workforce, they're helping. If we just opened it up, they'd be and gave them green cards and stuff, they would be able to work even more inside the system." Well, here's the fact: if illegal aliens are such a great thing for your economy, you'd think that the mayor of New York would be excited to have 100,000 illegal aliens in his town, in his city. But instead, what's happened is illegal aliens have effectively overrun their social services systems. So the cost of illegal aliens to the city of New York far exceeds the value, and hence, all those people who argue that this is a value add for the United States aren't living in reality. They're living in a world where the illegal aliens who are coming into our country are not net beneficiaries of our healthcare system, not net beneficiaries of our homeless system, and in fact are causing massive expenditures that wipe out any savings on the social welfare side of the budget, both state and federal budgets, that we should have from having relative full employment. So we're not getting the savings, we're not getting the benefit of full employment because we're essentially spending money as if we had $10 trillion. We had 10 million people unemployed, based upon the demands put on the system by the influx of illegal aliens in the open border. So it's not a simple problem, but it's pretty directly equatable. Let's see what else we have. Alistair Saris. Fiat is flat as the earth, not worth any silver or gold. Go broke, bad dealings. Yeah, one of the things about having a paper dollar and not having a gold currency is it inflates, and it's only as good as what other people say it's worth. But the fact of the matter is, our dollar is extremely strong right now. China's in huge problems. They are deflating their yuan pretty aggressively right now, and they're doing it because they need to export more products from China. So they have to make the products from China so cheap that Americans will put their conscience aside and say, well, I'll buy that from China. I'll buy that even though it's from China because it's $100 cheaper than the thing I was going to buy that's from Vietnam or Honduras or somewhere else. And so the Chinese are dramatically devaluing their dollar as a result of to try to be able to increase their exports to the United States because, quite honestly, for a variety of reasons, China's beginning to lose market share in the United States. And one of the primary reasons is because they're handling COVID. They failed. They kept shutting down their manufacturers, and they became an unreliable source of products for a lot of manufacturers who they're not acting based upon a moral imperative. They're acting because if I can't get the stuff I want to be able to sell on American shelves for Christmas from China, then I darn well better find somebody in Vietnam or somewhere else who's making it as a competitor. And so a lot of the shifting has gone from the Chinese economy to the Indian economy in particular, based upon that simple need. The Indian economy was able to continue providing goods or shift their resources to provide the goods that China wasn't making anymore, or was unable to make in quantity, or was unable to get to market. And as a result, China lost some market share, and now they're trying to get it back. And it'll be one of the big stories to watch to see if we end up with a significant amount of lower cost goods on our shelves for this Christmas, and whether the American people will sit there and say, okay, well, I don't like China very much, but I can save $100 on this TV, and I'm going to buy the 66-inch TV for $100 less, and that'll be a decision. That's how the market works, and China knows that, and they're going to try to lower. So they're going to try to lower prices by lowering the value of their currency relative to the U.S. currency. They've always pegged it, so they went up and down simultaneously. So no matter what we did with our currency, China always had a lower value. But now they're spreading that. They're spreading that so that it's even more of a spread. So so things that we buy with the U.S. dollar, since it was made in yuans, will be cheaper than it might from some other currency like the rupee or one of India's currency or Vietnamese dollar. I don't know what the Vietnamese dollar is, but so you get the idea. Anyway, we'll see what happens. I'm going to just, this was good Tuesday fare. I appreciate those of you who showed up after Labor Day. We'll continue doing these. I'm going to just let you know that we're going to spend some time on all the Biden stuff and all the criminal activity of the Biden administration. We're going to continue following what's going on with President Trump. We're going to continue following the move afoot to try to impose mandates and reimpose for the Biden administration, the good old days of absolute control through vaccine mandates and the like. So we're going to really we're following those things, but I always find it ironic. I'm just going to say this: the few people who are on still. I always find it ironic that we're Americans for limited government, and on this issue that matters, that's at the heart of the size and scope of government in the United States. It's really one of the things people care least about is the deficit and budgets and the like, because it's hard to understand it. I think most people sit there and throw up their hands saying nothing I can do. And it's that mirrors what I was told by an OMB director during the Trump administration, who I was challenging them to balance the budget and to take actions to cut spending and balance the budget. And I was told directly, when people start caring about that, we'll do it. But right now, nobody cares about that. And so we're going to continue covering this issue, because those of you who hang in on this obviously do care about it. But there's too few of us. And so what I ask you to do is spread the word, share this, subscribe if you can. That would be a great help to us if you subscribed to this, to our videos. And we'll continue producing quality content that gives you facts that you can share with people, so they know what's going on and actually can see for themselves what the problems are. And we can educate and inform, and and this next 3 weeks we're going to have a big old fight in Washington, D.C. And it's my hope that an informed group of people from Americans for Limited Government are able to weigh in on that fight and make a difference with their congressmen and their senators to try to start the process of getting this budget under control, getting this spending under control. And with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see you tomorrow.